get my 6. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid, the most popular homesteading channel on the entire internet that has nothing at all whatsoever to do with homesteading. I know, right? Couldn't have planned it better myself. If I would have tried to make that happen, I would have screwed it up. So I'm giving you a different angle today. This is a trail that goes off and then cuts 2 ways. That used to be our meadow up there. It's forest now. But it's been breezy this morning, and we're calling for higher winds this afternoon. And once upon a time, here on our property, I used to think that these things only came through here during certain times of the year. I thought they had their spring migration, their fall migration. No, that's not so. I believe they may or may not be here year-round. But there's certain types of weather conditions that kind of spur their movement or their activity. Breeze and wind is one of them I've discovered. So I'm going to read you a story today about him, her, it, or they. True story found in Bigfoot Sasquatch Files Anthology 1. This is volumes 1 through 10. This story actually comes from volume 6. A story called Winds of November. You can get these on Amazon in Kindle or print. If you want volume 1 through 10, which is the anthology one, you got to get this on our Etsy store. The links to both places are in the description box below. So you watch back here for movement. If you see any peakers, we've had a lot of peakers being spotted lately. Please give timestamps so other people can go back and see when and where him, her, it, or they are making appearances. And I'm going to get right into the story. So again, remember, listen to me, but watch back here, okay? Winds of November. The scariest night we ever spent in our house so far was the first. It's been 4 years ago now. Well, now it's going on 7. This was written several years ago. And I'll never forget it. We'd finally gotten everything we'd been wanting for the longest time, and we had no idea just how frightening that would be. Silence. Total. We'd only recently moved to the U.S., Central Virginia to be exact, from the Philippine Islands, where we'd spent our last 6 months in the capital city of Manila, close to the U.S. Embassy, so that the second my now wife's fiancé visa was granted, we could jump on the next plane to the U.S., which we did. While there, we lived in a nice condo on the 33rd floor of a 70-story high skyscraper right in the middle of the city. And despite the height, all we heard all day and all night was the honking of horns, the screeching of brakes and tires, and the shouts and screams of people. All we saw were lights, lights, and more lights at night, and smog, smog, and more smog by day. It made us long for a place out in the middle of nowhere, where there were no people, and where there was no smog, and where there were no noises other than the noises of nature. After having made it to the U.S. and spending a few months in an apartment complex nearly as rambunctious as Manila, we finally found our little homestead out in the middle of nowhere. We bought it, and the dream had been achieved. And that first night, again, was absolutely terrifying. I grew up in the mountains of Appalachistan, and all I'd ever known for the first quarter century of my life was silence at night, and mostly by day, once you got off the well-beaten path, that is. But that was years ago. I left Appalachistan, and I spent time in places like Seattle, and then on to Iraq, yes, a war zone, and then the Philippines. Somehow, and though it drove me crazy at first, I'd gotten used to the noises of the city, the combat zone, and both the rural and urban jungles of Southeast Asia. I'd forgotten the peace and tranquility of those beautiful country nights, though after years away from them, I longed for them. And yet when I got back to them, well, we've discussed this. No need to be redundant. I know, too late. I remember that first night lying in bed. It was a brand new king size that we'd had custom made for our new home. Well, new to us. It's nearly 120 years old. It's now actually over 120 years old. One of the last sharecropper houses built in the U.S., just before the Industrial Revolution would come along and change the landscape of the world economy, and with it, the world's way of living. My wife was on the opposite side of the bed that night, and our son, only 5 years old at the time, was sleeping in between us. Neither my wife nor my son had any problem falling asleep that first night. Not only had we spent the entire weekend moving our belongings from our apartment 20 miles away in the city, it took a few trips and 2 days of work, but our son had started kindergarten just a couple of weeks before. It was September, and we'd just gone through the jumping through hoops bullshit with his school in order for them to allow him to attend. You see, when we had our apartment in the city, we were one of those overcrowded, understaffed city school districts. But where our house is located, we're in the most privileged school district in our county and one of the most privileged in the country. Many of the kids who attend this school come from the families of trust fund babies and celebrities, and the school, though public, is better than most expensive private schools in the U.S. It's a huge part of the reason we bought our house where we did. We finally stood on one leg long enough while rubbing our bellies with one hand and patting our heads with the other after having given the principal a notarized copy of our real estate contract showing we were closing on our house in his school district only 2 weeks after the beginning of the school year, and permission for our son to attend the school was finally granted. It was an emotionally exhaustive process to go through while going through the emotional process of buying a house, all while going through the physically draining process of moving from our apartment to our house only 3 months after having moved 9,000 miles away from the Philippines to Virginia. Ugh, that was a very busy time in our life, very stressful. But despite this and being plenty exhausted myself, I could not sleep. It was too quiet, far too quiet, and my mind began playing tricks on me. In Mosul, Iraq, where I was stationed, our team ran night missions, and we tried to sleep during the day. Tried being the key word here. It was difficult, as our base, Diamondback it was called, was right in the center of the city, and our enemies who lived in the city would lob mortars at us all day, trying to kill us while we tried to sleep, in their attempts to keep us from coming out at night, just like the Diamondback rattlesnakes that we were. Eventually, by about halfway through the deployment, we were all on trazodone, which I equate to a horse tranquilizer, because trust me, once you take it, you are knocked the fuck out for the next 8 hours. It allowed us to sleep through the barrage of mortars that never stopped the entire time we were there. And you might think that sleep in the middle of a jungle in the most remote locations in the Philippines after that would be easier, but it was actually harder. You see, Filipinos love to sing, especially when they're drunk, and there are these little karaoke bars all over the islands. And by bars, I mean just these little bamboo shacks where the proprietor is one of the few in the village fortunate enough to be able to afford electricity, allowing them to purchase or lease a karaoke machine that the locals pay 1 pesos, about 2 cents in U.S. money, to sing a karaoke song. And they do this until 3 a.m. with the volume on high, and the entire village gets to hear it all. And then at 5 a.m., the morning vendors start roaming through the villages, screaming at the top of their lungs whatever it is they're selling. Ista, ista, the fish vendors yell. Gulay, gulay, the vegetable vendors yell. Of course, those words meaning fish and vegetables in Visayan. And sleep, at least for Westerners not accustomed to such behavior, becomes as elusive as, well, for the lack of a better comparison, Bigfoot Sasquatch. But as I lay in that brand new, overpriced, custom-made king-size bed that first night in our new house on our Virginia homestead, my mind got the better of me and it kept me from sleep. At least in Iraq, when I heard the mortars, I knew who or what was out there. A bunch of people trying to kill me. When I was in the Philippines, as loud as it was out in the jungles at night, I knew what was out there. Drunken Filipinos crucifying Bon Jovi and Journey. Little old men with slimy eats from the sea and their little old wives selling the products of their labor in their gardens. And even in Manila, I'd learned to differentiate the sound of a taxicab's horn and that of a jeepney. But here in Central Virginia, where there wasn't a street light for 20 miles, there could be anything out there just on the other side of the walls of our house, and it could be creeping up on our house, and it could even be peering into the windows of our house, and we would have no way of knowing because it was so freaking dark. I'd forgotten how dark it gets at night when there are no artificial lights. I'd forgotten how quiet it is where there are no bombs, car horns, or drunken Filipinos or vendors. Sure, I could hear the frogs in the pond in the front yard, and it was a welcome sound, and I could hear the crickets chirping, and their presence was welcome as well, but when both would go silent, and then a floorboard would creak as the house settled, or the tin roof would pop as it cooled in the night after having baked in the sun all day, I was out of bed on my feet and walking around to investigate with an aluminum baseball bat in my hands. Eventually, and just a few nights later, I would finally accept the fact that I was where I was, and this is how the nights were where I was, and it's what I'd wanted, not to fear it, but to embrace it. In a word, I began sleeping like a baby by the end of the first week in our new, to us, house. Until November, when the winds of November came, and brought something ominous and fearsome with them. We settled into our new routine in our new home on our new land relatively quickly. A lot of it simply had to do with the fact that we were worn out from our topsy-turvy life of the past year. I'd spent 6 months alone in the U.S. getting Dearly's visa. That's my wife, if you're new to the channel. We'd moved my family back in the Philippines 3 times during that time after getting word of kidnapping plots on my son in hopes of hefty ransoms. And then I'd gone back, stayed with my family in Manila for 6 months before coming to the U.S. together, and then renting for 3 months, appeasing the powers that be in the public school system, and then finally settling down on our homestead after moving in. It was literally our 8th move in a year. This is counting another time we moved while living in Manila simply because my wife had picked a real shithole of a place to live there, right across from the Mall of Asia, before I'd flown back to live with her and our son. It was a small room about the size of a closet, the typical type of living arrangements made by many of the service workers in the area who work 12-hour days and merely need a small space to sleep in when not working. This was not good for us, by my standards, so I'd moved us to Makati City, the most high-end part of Manila, and we quite enjoyed our stay there for the 5 months we were there after having spent a month in the broom closet. Though settled, we were still quite busy. Our son's school was nearly half an hour's drive away from our property, and we were taking him there in the mornings and going and picking him up in the afternoons. Yes, there's a bus, and yes, he does ride it these days, but it took us that first year to get over the idea of someone constantly trying to kidnap him for ransom, so we were not about to let him out of our sight. Takes a while to get used to a new way of living and giving up the old one, you know. So, when we'd get home from picking him up from school in the afternoons, we'd often lay on our air mattress out in the lawn underneath one of our many walnut trees for shade because it was still September and then October, and in our part of Central Virginia, it is still quite hot that time of year. We would lay together, the 3 of us, and stare into our fields, which are now meadows and quickly on their way to becoming a forest, which pretty much forest now, and watch the deer and the rabbits. We've seen the occasional bear and turkey. So many hawks fly above our place regularly, you'd think it was a bird of prey preserve, and there are far too many gray squirrels to count. By the way, yesterday I saw a white squirrel. It was an albino gray squirrel. I think it's the first one I've ever seen. I saw it on my morning run. It was only 3/4 of a mile away from my house. Sounds like we have company, and they want me to get on with the story. Timestamps, people, timestamps. Often on these first afternoons at our new home, and it was finally our home after all those years of moving around due to poverty and safety concerns, we would fall asleep in the field on our air mattress and wake up just in time to go inside, have dinner, and then fall asleep for the night in our bed. Then, as if the winds had a calendar, just as it turned November 1, a few minutes after midnight, the winds whipped up something fierce, as they'd say here in the South, and my feeling of peace left, and I was right back to where I'd been that first week in our home. You see, as our land lay, and as the land around it lays, it makes for the perfect scenario for heavy winds. There's a small river down the road and over the hill from our property. It's about 200 yards away, and all the land beside the road, once passing our property, is wooded. Our land is the first open land in the immediate area. It was formerly hayfields. So when the temperatures began dropping drastically in November, and the water temperature is actually higher than the air temperature around it, it creates a draft. And since the land around the river, except for the road, is all wooded, the easiest way for the draft to escape and rise, as warm air does, is to come up the road. Then, once these warm drafts reach our property, they go batshit crazy because they have the space. The winds, FYI, wind is defined as the result of uneven heating and cooling of the Earth's surface, in case you didn't know. Yes, I majored in science in college. Most people don't realize that because I'm a writer and a social media content creator. I'm not quite as dumb as some people would like to think I am, but don't tell them, because then they can't figure out why I always get the turn of the tables on them in a business deal. Then the winds whip up around like crazy on our 6 acres. It's as if they run around playing tag with each other until they spin themselves out. Our old house has beautiful old eaves that hang over each window. They're angled perfectly for keeping the sun's direct shine out of the windows during the summer, but they allow for it to shine in during winter. These were necessary when the house was built because air conditioning at the time was a fantasy at most, as was heating systems outside of wood stoves and fireplaces. Neither had been invented yet. These days, the eaves are not necessary, but we leave them because it helps our old house look more rustic. We feel like we're living in an antique, which I guess we are. The house is listed on the historical registry here in Virginia. Anyway, the point to all this is that as those winds on the first night of November reached our property and then our house, they lifted these eaves above the windows, at least the ones upstairs, and then as the winds passed on, the eaves would drop back into their natural place, and it sounded as if someone was jumping around in the upstairs bedrooms of our house. When this first happened, I awoke with a start, immediately believing I was back in Mosul, Iraq, and that another SVBID, Suicide Vehicle-Borne Improvised Explosive Device, had rammed into the gate, killing all the guards and making a hole for an insurgent attack. I sat up and I reached to the side of my bed to grab my M4, but alas, it was not there. I jumped up, ready to find it, and that's when I saw my wife and our son sleeping in our custom-made king-size bed, and I remembered where I was. And then it happened again. Another slam from upstairs convinced me someone was in the house. I may not have had my M4 ready at my bed, but I did have an aluminum baseball bat that I keep there to this day for such events. For some reason, oh, and let me point out, for anybody who's curious, among other things, crayons, people, crayons. For some reason, I've had a couple people out this way ask me if I have firearms. I had no idea why I was asked this at first, but I've since come to believe that they asked this because they are anti-gun types. Yes, I'm out in the country, but it is right outside of a university town, and there are tons of those types out here. And they wanted to judge me as a gun nutter had I said yes. I did not answer their question, and I will not answer it here, but what I told them was exactly where my bedroom window was located, and I challenged them to come climbing through it at 2 a.m. some night and find out. They both, two different beta males on two different occasions, simply turned and walked away and never came back. Anyway, isn't that an odd question? That's true. I mean, people just out of nowhere comes up, oh, hi, welcome to the neighborhood. We're curious, do you possess firearms? That's almost exactly how it happened. It's like, what the? So I told him, so you see that window over there? Yeah, that's my bedroom window. Come crawling through it at 2 a.m. some night and you'll find out. They took off. Anyway, I took my bat and I headed upstairs. I heard the slams a couple more times on my way up. They were coming from our son's room. He hadn't actually moved into his room yet because allowing him to sleep with us that first year here, even though he was already in kindergarten, was part of our cooling down process as well. Let me tell you, when you have to spend the first 5 years of your kid's life worrying about them being kidnapped for ransom because their father is a white foreigner living in a non-white third world country riddled with terrorists and common criminals, old habits are hard to break. However, we since have, and it's a really nice feeling being able to let our guards down just a bit. The door to my son's room was open, and though the light was off, I could still see into the room quite well. We had not hung the blinds yet, and the moon happened to be almost full that night, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. So the light from the moon was coming through the windows, lighting the place up almost as if it were day. As I was looking out the window, a gust picked up and slammed the eave again, and this time I saw the actual movement of the eave, and I heard and felt the resulting slam, and I was immediately set to ease. I laughed at myself as I lowered the baseball bat from my shoulder, but then I immediately raised it again. As I was peering outside the window, I saw something large scurry around the side of our detached garage, which sits outside and below the window. And what I'd seen was no animal on all fours. What I'd seen for just a moment was walking upright on two legs, and it was big, very big. I didn't go to the window, knowing that I was far enough away from the window so that I could see out of it, but if anyone or anything was outside looking in, they could not see me. If I were to get close to the window, whoever or whatever was out there would be able to see me. I stood motionless for a minute, and realizing a drawn bat would be of no use to someone or something outside the window, I lowered it again, but I remained vigilant. A couple more minutes passed, during which time the eave outside the window banged and slammed a couple more times, and then I saw it again. Actually, two of them. I could not believe what I was seeing at first, and I actually did move to the window this time to get a better view. What I saw completely blew my mind, and it would take me nearly a year to come to accept what it is that I saw, though I have to admit that at the time, I believe I already knew. At first, there was only one large, and I mean really large creature walking on two legs away from the back of the detached garage and up the hill of what was in our upper field, which is exactly where this camera is angled up here. It goes into a pretty thick forest back there that goes for miles. It had recently been cut for hay, this field of ours, which is no longer a field, as we'd allowed the man who'd taken the hay from the land for years. The land had belonged to his mother's cousin before we bought it, take one last cut before using the land exclusively for our own purposes. The man was, and still is, a total dickbag, and my immediate instincts told me at the time that it was this very man, the annoying neighbor that I would eventually have to run off with a crayon, that I was seeing outside that night. I believed he was stalking us, because he actually did for a while. He harassed us relentlessly for a while, because we wouldn't let him take the hay, and that he was outside being a peeping Tom, which he'd actually been fired from the University of Virginia for being, I would later find out. He was like a grounds maintenance guy or something. And I was about to run out the back door and give him a good old-fashioned Appalachistanian hillbilly ass-whooping. But then, the first creature was joined by a second. This one was just a bit smaller, but it was still massive in size. It occurred to me that these creatures were not men. They were not human, though they appeared to take human form. That is, as long as you consider professional NFL tight ends and WWE wrestlers. They had to be nearly 8 feet tall, and if I were a betting man, which I'm not because I've always been too good at math to gamble or play the lottery, I would wager they weighed close to 800 pounds. I watched in awe as these two entities slowly and methodically, while looking back on occasion, made their way to the top of the hill about 400 yards away before slipping into the woods behind my house. I rubbed my eyes a few times as they made their way up the hill, and I even pinched myself once, and sure enough, I was fully awake, as I would remain for the rest of that night, despite the winds of November finally dying down and the ceasing of the banging of the eaves. As I lay in bed the rest of the night, I questioned my sanity. I mean, I knew I was messed up a bit from the war. I knew I was messed up due to my time in the Philippines and the events that took place there. I knew I had issues due to personal losses resulting from both. But I knew I wasn't crazy. Well, that much. But I knew what I'd seen. It would take more experiences like this one, and it would later take confirmation from some really supportive, incredible people on a YouTube channel we now have that did not exist at the time. This one, the one you're watching. That first fall that we were in our new home on our property. But today I have every reason to believe I know exactly what I saw, and only for the first time on that November night when I'd been awakened by the winds of November. Potentially 2 Bigfoot Sasquatch. There you have it, people. That's the story of the first time I believe I saw what may or may not have been Bigfoot Sasquatches on this property. That was 2016, almost 7 years ago. And of course, if you've been following for a while, you remember the story of the drone in the tree that was returned to us. I'll retell it here at some point for those that are new. We're getting like tons of new viewers every month because of the shorts. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's been a while since I've come up and told a story. Again, if you want the big thick one, this, by the way, is the largest single collection of Bigfoot Sasquatch stories ever written in the English language. It's available in our Etsy store with an autograph, or you can buy them individually, volumes 1 through, I think they're up to 15 now, on Amazon and print or Kindle. Check out my other books on Amazon. I highly recommend a book called The Lunatic. Amazing book. It's changed people's lives. It predicted one of the most recent tragedies in the U.S. 2 years before it took place. But again, nobody wants to listen to common sense. Nobody wants to hear anything about common sense anymore. They want to blame political ideologies and view themselves as victims when the writing is right there on the wall. So anyway, read The Lunatic, and maybe you can help stop the next one. So if you saw it, timestamp it. See you for more next time.